America was once ruled by a walking corpse. In 1919, a massive stroke left President Woodrow Wilson paralyzed and broken. His wife, Edith, refused to cede power. She locked the bedroom doors and secretly ran the government for 17 months. She was the first de facto female president and the architect of the most audacious cover-up in American history, the Zombie Presidency. Wilson possessed a brilliant, diamond-hard intellect that could not tolerate the friction of disagreement. At Princeton University, he went beyond simply debating his opponents. He demonized them. He spent years fighting a vicious petty war against a dean over the location of a graduate school building. He refused to compromise on a single brick, eventually burning down his own academic career rather than share power. This was his fatal flaw, a rigidity so brittle that when the world refused to bend to his will, he would break himself trying to force it. Beneath the austere suit and the pince-nez glasses, Wilson was physically rotting from the inside for decades. The official biographies painted him as a tireless worker, but his medical charts told a story of a vascular system under siege. In 1896, a minor stroke left his right hand numb for months. 10 years later, he woke up blind in his left eye from a retinal hemorrhage, his blood pressure screaming for relief. These were not random misfortunes. They were warning shots from a body that could no longer sustain the fire of his ambition. Wilson ignored them all. He taught himself to write with his left hand and pressed on, treating his own mortality as an inconvenience to be overruled by sheer force of will. By the summer of 1919, that will was the only thing holding him together. He had returned from Paris with the Treaty of Versailles, the document that would secure eternal peace through the League of Nations. But the United States Senate refused to sign it without changes. Where a healthy politician would have negotiated and a rational leader would have counted votes, Wilson remained blinded by his own self-righteousness and likely suffering from the early stages of dementia. The early stages of dementia brought on by silent mini-strokes. He viewed the senators not as legislators, but as heretics. He decided to bypass Washington entirely. He would take a train across the country, looking the American people in the eye, believing his oratory alone could force the Senate's hand. His doctor, Cary Grayson, begged him to stop, warning that the trip would kill him. Wilson replied that he would gladly give his life for the cause. The presidential train, the Mayflower, departed in September 1919, becoming a rolling coffin. For 22 days, the heat, the dust, and the relentless clacking of the wheels acted as a torture device on Wilson's fraying nervous system. He suffered blinding headaches that felt like a hammer striking his skull. He saw double vision, the faces of the crowds blurring into grotesque shapes. Yet, at every stop, he dragged his failing body to the rear platform to preach his gospel. The crowds cheered the performance, unaware they were watching a man actively dying in front of them. The end came in Pueblo, Colorado. Wilson stumbled through his speech, tears streaming down his face, his voice cracking with an emotion that terrified his aides. That night, inside his cabin, the dam broke. He collapsed, crying out that his head was splitting open. Dr. Grayson found him drooling, his speech slurred, the left side of his face sagging. The tour was canceled, the blinds were drawn. The train sped back to Washington, clearing the tracks of all other traffic like a funeral procession. Back at the White House, a terrifying silence settled over the residents. The president shuffled through the halls in an old sweater, looking dazed, complaining that the furniture was haunted. He was a ghost haunting his own house, waiting for the final blow. On the night of October 1st, he read a chapter from the Bible and turned out the light. The facade had cracked. By the next morning, the man himself would shatter. The morning of October 2nd, 1919, broke over Washington with a gray, suffocating dampness. Inside the executive mansion, the air was already stale, heavy with the phantom weight of the sleepless night that had preceded it. The White House staff moved through the corridors in hushed tones, aware that the master of the house was unwell, though they had no conception of the abyss that was opening beneath their feet. Woodrow Wilson had risen early, a creature of habit, even in his decay, but the man who woke that morning was not the president the world knew. He was a biological system in total collapse, a machine whose gears were grinding against each other, stripping metal, preparing to seize. At shortly after 8 o'clock, Edith Wilson was in her dressing room, preparing for another day of guarding her husband's fragile health. The plan was simple: a drive in the fresh air, perhaps a little light reading, anything to keep the stress of the Senate and the League of Nations at bay. Then she heard it. It was not a shout or a cry for help, but a sound far more terrifying in its domestic banality, the thud of a heavy object striking the floor in the president's private bathroom, followed by a silence that screamed. Edith rushed to the door. It was locked. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She called out his name, Woodrow. There was no answer, only the faint, wet sound of labored breathing on the other side of the wood. When she finally managed to force her way in, the sight that greeted her would remain burned into her retinas until the day she died 42 years later. The President of the United States was lying crumpled on the cold tile floor. He had fallen with such dead weight that he had struck his head on the plumbing fixtures. There was blood. It smeared his nose and cut a jagged line across his temple, a shocking splash of red against the ghostly pallor of his skin. But the blood was the least of the horror. As Edith knelt beside him, trying to lift the man who had once commanded the armies of the free world, she saw the true extent of the devastation. His face, once the austere visage of Presbyterian rectitude, had been unmade. The left side was slack, sliding off the bone like melting wax. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque sneer, pulling sharply to the right. His left arm lay useless at his side, a piece of dead meat attached to a living torso. His left leg was equally unresponsive. When he tried to speak to explain the catastrophe that had befallen him, only a strangled, guttural noise emerged from his throat. The eloquence that had seduced millions in Paris, the voice that had declared war and peace, had been extinguished in a single burst of an artery. Suppressing the urge to scream or faint, Edith acted with the terrified, ferocious instinct of a cornered animal protecting its mate. She managed to drag him, half carrying his dead weight, from the bathroom to the Lincoln bed in the adjoining room. She arranged him on the pillows, wiping the blood from his face with a cold cloth, trying to reshape the ruin of his features before anyone else could see. Only then did she act. Bypassing both the vice president and the cabinet, she summoned Dr. Cary Grayson. Grayson arrived within minutes, his face setting into a mask of professional dread as he entered the room. The smell of the sick room was already rising, the metallic tang of blood, the sour odor of fear sweat. He approached the bed and began his examination. The diagnosis was immediate and catastrophic. This was not nervous exhaustion. It was a massive ischemic stroke, a thrombosis of the middle cerebral artery in the right hemisphere of the brain. The blood flow to the control centers of Wilson's motor functions and emotional regulation had been severed. The brain tissue was dying, starving for oxygen, turning into a necrotic lesion that would never heal. The doctor tested the president's reflexes. There were none on the left side. He checked the pupils. They were unresponsive. He listened to the breathing. It was developing the terrifying rhythm known as Cheney-Stokes respiration, a cyclical pattern of deep, rapid breathing, followed by periods of apnea, where the patient stops breathing entirely for seconds at a time. In 1919, this sound was known to every physician as the death rattle. It was the sound of the brainstem struggling to maintain the most basic functions of life. Grayson stood back, his hands shaking slightly. He knew with absolute medical certainty that the presidency of Woodrow Wilson was over. The man in the bed might survive the day, perhaps even the week, but the leader was dead. As the morning wore on, the circle of knowledge began to widen, but only by inches. Grayson knew he needed a specialist, a second opinion to confirm the nightmare. He summoned Dr. Francis Dercum, a renowned neurologist from Philadelphia. But even in this moment of acute medical emergency, the instinct for secrecy took precedence over protocol. Dercum was not brought in through the front door with sirens and urgency. He was smuggled into the White House like a thief, entering through the servants' entrance, ushered quickly up the back stairs to avoid the prying eyes of the press corps stationed in the West Wing. Inside the bedroom, Dercum performed a spinal tap. The fluid was clear, ruling out a hemorrhage, confirming the clot. The prognosis he delivered to Edith and Grayson was brutal in its finality. The president had suffered a complete hemiplegia. Recovery was impossible. At best, he might regain some movement in his leg. At worst, he would remain a bedridden invalid, prone to emotional outbursts, confusion, and death. Dercum looked at Edith Wilson, a woman who had been First Lady for 4 years, and told her the truth. Her husband could never work again. The stress of the presidency, the mental taxation of the office, would kill him instantly if he attempted to resume his duties. This was the moment of decision. This was the hinge upon which the history of the 20th century turned. The Constitution of the United States in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, stated that in the case of the president's inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. The text was clear, but the mechanism was not. Who determined inability? Was it the doctors, the cabinet, the president himself? Vice President Thomas R. Marshall sat in his office just down the street, completely unaware that the heavy mantle of power was rightfully his. Marshall was a genial, witty man, a former governor of Indiana, who was largely ignored by the Wilson administration. He was kept out of cabinet meetings, kept in the dark about foreign policy, and treated as a nuisance. Edith Wilson despised him. She viewed him as a small man, a politician of the old, corrupt school, unworthy of untying her husband's shoelaces. The thought of handing Woodrow's legacy, his beloved League of Nations, over to Marshall was physically repulsiveness to her. In the darkened bedroom, with the curtains drawn against the midday sun, a conspiracy was hatched. Lacking signed documents or sworn oaths, this conspiracy was born of desperation and rationalized by love. Dr. Dercum, looking at the weeping First Lady, offered a lifeline that was also a poison pill. He told her that if Wilson were to resign, if he were stripped of his title and his purpose, the psychological shock would stop his heart. For him to step down would be to sign his death warrant, Dercum said. Edith Wilson heard only one thing: resignation equals death. To save her husband's life, she had to keep him president. It was a monstrous leap of logic, a complete suspension of ethical duty in favor of personal devotion. She looked at the doctors and made her decree. The president would not resign. The vice president would not be notified of the severity of the condition. The cabinet would not be convened. She, Edith, would become the steward. She would build a wall around that bed so high and so thick that no reality could penetrate it. The doctors, bound by the patient-doctor confidentiality of the era, and perhaps awed by the ferocity of the First Lady, agreed. They became co-conspirators in the cover-up. They drafted the first press release of the new regime. It was a masterpiece of deception. Issued at 10 p.m. that night, it read, "The president is a very sick man. His condition is less favorable today, and he has remained in bed throughout the day. After consultation with Dr. Durkham of Philadelphia, the diagnosis is nervous exhaustion." Nervous exhaustion? The phrase was innocuous, suggesting a man who needed a long nap, not a man whose brain was dying. It was a lie that would be repeated, refined, and defended for 17 months. Downstairs, the White House was transforming into a fortress. The gates were locked. The ushers were instructed that no one, absolutely no one, was to come to the second floor without the express written permission of the First Lady. The telephone lines to the residence were disconnected or diverted. The mail, which usually flowed into the Oval Office in great sacks, was rerouted to Edith's sitting room. Secretary to the President, Joseph Tumulty, a loyal political operator who had served Wilson for years, was one of the few who sensed the true gravity of the situation. He caught Grayson in the hallway, grabbing the doctor by the lapels. "My God, Carrie," he whispered. "Is he going to die?" Grayson, pale and shaking, looked at his friend and uttered words that should have triggered the 25th Amendment instantly. "He is paralyzed. One side of his body is gone. If he lives, he will never be much more than a vegetable." But Tumulty, too, was a Wilson loyalist. Instead of rushing to the vice president, he joined the circle of silence. He realized that the Democratic Party, already facing a brutal election in 1920, would be annihilated if it became known that their leader was incapacitated. Political survival aligned perfectly with Edith's personal desperation. The pact was sealed. As night fell on October 2nd, the White House became a Gothic castle. The lights in the residence were dimmed to protect the president's eyes. The nurses moved like phantoms in soft-soled shoes. Equipment began to arrive: oxygen tanks, bedpans, feeding tubes, hidden in laundry baskets to avoid the press. The smell of the room began to change. The scent of fresh-cut flowers overwhelmed by the antiseptic sting of iodine and the musk of a body in revolt. In the center of it all lay Woodrow Wilson, drifting in and out of a coma. In his delirium, he mumbled about the treaty, about the French, about the ghosts of Princeton. He was no longer leading the country. He was barely inhabiting his own body. But on paper, he was still the most powerful man on earth. Outside the gates, the world turned. The Senate debated. The stock market fluctuated. Treaties waited to be signed. Ambassadors waited to be received. They were all waiting for a man who no longer existed. Edith sat by the bedside, holding his good hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She was no longer just a wife. She was the gatekeeper. She looked at the door to the hallway, the door that separated the sick room from the United States government, and she made a silent vow. That door would stay closed. If the world wanted Woodrow Wilson, they would have to go through her. The coup had begun not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a latch sliding into place. The president was dead. Long live the president. The White House, usually a cathedral of light and open doors, had transformed overnight into a mausoleum. By the middle of October 1919, the autumn leaves were turning gold along Pennsylvania Avenue, but inside the executive mansion, the season was permanently winter. The heavy velvet curtains in the residential quarters were drawn tight against the sun, plunging the hallways into a perpetual dusty twilight. The usual bustling sounds of governance, the click of typewriters, the heavy tread of military aides, the ringing of telephones, had been silenced by a terrifying decree from the second floor. Silence was now the supreme law of the land. The servants, men and women who had served presidents since Roosevelt, moved like specters, communicating in whispers, terrified that the sound of a dropped tray or a loud footstep might shatter the fragile existence of the invalid behind the double doors. Behind those doors, the President of the United States was fighting a war not for democracy, but for the basic dignity of his own biological functions. The stroke on October 2nd had been the opening salvo, but the weeks that followed were a descent into a private hell that the public could scarcely imagine. The paralysis of his left side had extended to his internal organs. By mid-October, Woodrow Wilson developed a prostate obstruction so severe that his body could not eliminate toxins. The pain was blinding, a constant, searing agony that made the previous headaches seem like a mercy. He developed a high fever, hallucinating that the furniture in his room was alive, that the patterns on the wallpaper were spies sent by Henry Cabot Lodge to torment him. The smell in the room became thick and oppressive, a suffocating cocktail of stale sweat, the chemical sting of antiseptics, the metallic odor of blood from the frequent catheterizations, and the undeniable scent of mortal decay. In this crucible of suffering, Edith Bowling Galt Wilson ceased to be merely a first lady. She underwent a metamorphosis that no constitution had ever anticipated. She became the steward, a term she would later use in her memoirs, to soften the reality of her actions. But to the men waiting downstairs in the West Wing, she was something far more formidable. She was the Cerberus guarding the gates of hell. She established a regime of absolute isolation. No one saw the president, not the vice president, not the cabinet, not the press, and certainly not the leaders of the Democratic Party who were desperate for guidance. The mechanism of her control was simple, brutal, and totally effective. She positioned herself as the sole conduit between the president and the outside world. Every document, every letter, every memo, and every piece of legislation that arrived at the White House had to pass through her hands first. She set up a workspace in the dressing room, adjacent to the sick room, a makeshift Oval Office, where the only furniture was a vanity table and a stiff-backed chair. There, under the dim light of a silk-shaded lamp, Edith Wilson began to govern the United States. She did not merely ferry papers. She curated reality. She would sit for hours sifting through the mountains of urgent state business, reports on the coal strikes threatening to freeze the nation, diplomatic cables regarding the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, frantic pleas from ambassadors in Europe. She read them with the eye of a woman whose only qualification was her fierce, protective love for her husband. If a document contained bad news, if it was too complex, or if it came from someone she personally disliked, she would toss it into a to-be-ignored pile. She decided what Woodrow Wilson needed to see, and more importantly, what he didn't need to see. She justified this censorship as medical necessity, telling herself that bad news would spike his blood pressure and kill him. But in practice, it meant that the president's mind was being fed a diet of illusions. He believed the country was calm because Edith told him it was. He believed the Senate was bending to his will because Edith hid the newspapers that said otherwise. When a decision was absolutely unavoidable, Edith would enter the darkened bedroom with a singular sheet of paper. She would lean over the bed, the smell of her perfume mixing with the sickroom odors, and whisper a simplified summary of the issue into his ear. Wilson, drugged and exhausted, would struggle to focus his good eye on her face. He would mumble a few words, a yes, a no, or a vague instruction. Edith would then retreat to her desk and write the order herself. This process birthed a terrifying question that haunted the West Wing. Who was actually making the decisions? When a memo came back down from the residence with a scrawled note in the margins, was it the distilled wisdom of Woodrow Wilson, or was it the impulse of Edith Wilson? The handwriting on these documents tells a forensic story of the cover-up. In the early days, the notes were entirely in Edith's bold, round script. The president says, or the president directs. But as time went on, the pretense thinned. There were documents where the instructions were terse, angry, and vindictive, traits that mirrored Edith's personality more than Woodrow's scholarly tone. She began to shape policy by the sheer force of exclusion. If she didn't like a cabinet member, their requests simply disappeared into the void of the second floor. The physical act of signing laws and executive orders became a macabre ritual. The president's right hand was weak, shaking uncontrollably due to the neurological trauma. He could not hold a pen steady enough to produce the flowing, authoritative Woodrow Wilson that the world recognized. So, Edith devised a system. She would place the pen in his trembling fingers, then wrap her own warm, steady hand over his cold, withered one. Together, they would guide the nib across the paper. The result was a signature that looked like a seismograph of an earthquake, jagged, erratic, often trailing off into nothingness. To hide this, Edith restricted the number of documents he signed to the absolute minimum. For everything else, she used a rubber stamp, or simply issued verbal orders to Joseph Tumulty, the president's secretary, claiming they came directly from the bedside. Tumulty was the tragic figure in this petticoat government, a loyal Irish Catholic political operative who had worshipped Wilson for years. He found himself trapped between his duty to the country and his loyalty to the woman who now held his boss hostage. He knew the truth. He saw the doctors coming and going with their grim faces. He saw the signed documents that were clearly forged or guided. But he was terrified that if he spoke out, Edith would cut him off completely, and the president would be left with no political allies at all. So Tumulty became the mouthpiece of the lie. He held daily press briefings where he spun elaborate fictions about the president's steady progress. He told reporters that Wilson was handling urgent business and taking short walks, when in reality Wilson was being spoon-fed broth and crying because he couldn't remember the names of his daughters. But silence, no matter how strictly enforced, creates a vacuum that rumors rush to fill. By November 1919, Washington was awash in a flood of hysteria. The whisper campaign was vicious and contradictory. In the cloakrooms of the Senate, men whispered that Wilson was dead, and Edith was keeping the body on ice until she could secure a pension. Others claimed he had gone insane, running through the White House corridors howling at the moon, foaming at the mouth like a rabid dog. A particularly persistent rumor held that Wilson had contracted syphilis in Paris, and the stroke was actually the final stage of tertiary neurosyphilis eating his brain. The most dangerous rumor, however, was the one closest to the truth, that a woman was running the country. Senator Albert Fall, a Republican hawk who despised Wilson, began to refer to the administration as the petticoat government. It was a sexist slur meant to demean, but it struck a nerve because it was accurate. The Constitution had been suspended, replaced by the whims of a First Lady who had never been elected to anything. The tension within the administration reached its breaking point with Secretary of State Robert Lansing. Lansing was a lawyer, a man of rules and precedents. He was the only member of the cabinet who dared to open the Constitution and read Article 2, Section 1 aloud. He saw the paralysis of the executive branch not as a tragedy, but as a legal crisis. The country was drifting. The coal strike was crippling industry. Inflation was skyrocketing. The Mexican border was unstable. The ship of state had no captain. Lansing began to convene cabinet meetings on his own authority. He gathered the department heads in the cabinet room, presided over the empty chair at the head of the table, and tried to keep the government functioning. It was a pragmatic move, necessary for the survival of the nation. But when news of these meetings reached the darkened bedroom on the second floor, it was received as an act of treason. In Edith Wilson's eyes, the Secretary of State was not a helper, but a Brutus holding a knife. Her hatred for Lansing was absolute. She fed this poison to her husband. In the quiet moments when Wilson was lucid, she would whisper to him that Lansing was plotting a coup, that he was trying to steal the presidency, that he was a traitor to the ideals of the League of Nations. Wilson, his mind already clouded by paranoia and sickness, absorbed her words like gospel. The stroke had stripped away his emotional inhibitors, leaving only raw anger and suspicion. He began to obsess over Lansing's betrayal. The confrontation, when it finally exploded, was executed via letter, a series of missives that historians now believe were drafted largely by Edith herself. In February 1920, months after the stroke, a letter was sent from the president to Lansing. It was icy, cruel, and bizarrely focused on the usurpation of power regarding the cabinet meetings. It demanded Lansing's resignation. The Secretary of State, stunned by the pettiness and the irrationality of the attack, had no choice but to comply. When the news broke, Washington was aghast. The president, who supposedly was too sick to see visitors, had suddenly summoned the energy to fire his most important minister for the crime of trying to keep the government running? It didn't make sense. It was the lash of a tyrant, or the panicked swipe of a protector removing a threat. Edith had won. She had decapitated the only rival who could have invoked the 25th Amendment, had it existed, or forced a resignation. With Lansing gone, the cabinet fell into line, terrified of the invisible queen upstairs. While Edith was purging the cabinet, she also had to manage the theater of diplomacy. The world did not stop just because Woodrow Wilson had fallen. In November 1919, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, arrived in Washington for a state visit. It was a visit that could not be canceled without causing an international incident. Edith knew this was the ultimate test of her stagecraft. She had to present her husband to the heir of the British throne without revealing that he was a broken shell. The scene she orchestrated was a masterpiece of Gothic horror. She arranged the meeting in the president's bedroom, claiming that he was resting. She staged the meeting with calculated precision, using heavy shadows to hide the paralyzed side of his face. Wilson appeared as a silhouette, a gray ghost greeting the vibrant young prince. She propped him up in bed with a mountain of pillows, covering his paralyzed arm with a shawl, dressing him in a smoking jacket that swallowed his shrunken frame. When the young, vibrant prince entered the room, he brought with him the energy of a new generation. Handsome, charming, alive. The contrast with the man in the bed was heartbreaking. Wilson was a gray ghost, his skin the color of old parchment, his voice a reedy whisper. The prince, coached by the British ambassador to be brief, stayed only a few minutes. He made polite conversation, praising Wilson's vision. Wilson managed to nod and mutter a few pleasantries. Edith stood guard the entire time, hovering like a hawk, ready to intervene if her husband began to drool or speak nonsense. The moment the prince left, Wilson collapsed back into the pillows, exhausted by the effort of existing for 10 minutes. The prince later told his aides that he had been shocked by the president's appearance, describing him as a shattered man. But publicly, the British maintained the diplomatic fiction. The show had gone on. Edith had successfully paraded the corpse of the presidency and convinced the world it was still alive, but the greatest tragedy of the petticoat government was not the firing of Lansing or the deception of the prince. It was the death of the Treaty of Versailles. This was the issue that had broken Wilson's health, and now it was the issue that would seal his tragic legacy. The Senate was gridlocked. The Republicans, led by Lodge, were willing to ratify the treaty if Wilson accepted reservations, amendments that would limit American obligations to the League of Nations. It was a compromise, yes, but it would have brought the United States into the League. It would have validated Wilson's life's work. Senator Gilbert Hitchcock, the Democratic minority leader, was desperate. He came to the White House repeatedly, begging to see the president, begging for permission to compromise. "We can get the treaty passed," he told Tumulty, "if he just gives us an inch." But Hitchcock never got to see the president. He only got to see Edith, and Edith was not interested in compromise. She was interested in vindication. She carried the senator's pleas into the sick room, but she filtered them through her own resentment. She told Wilson that the Republicans were trying to humiliate him, that compromising now would be a surrender to the men who had caused his stroke. She fed his martyrdom. Wilson, lying in the dark, his mind rigid and inflamed, growled his response, "Let the Lodge reservations go to hell." He would rather have no treaty than a compromised one. He dictated a letter to the Democrats in the Senate, "Vote down the reservations." It was a suicide pact. On November 19, 1919, and again in March 1920, the Senate voted on the treaty. Following Wilson's orders that were enforced and delivered by Edith, the Democrats joined the irreconcilable Republicans to vote against the compromise version. The treaty failed. The United States would never join the League of Nations. In a cruel twist of irony, Edith Wilson, believing she was protecting her husband's legacy, inadvertently destroyed it. A healthy Woodrow Wilson might have had the political acumen to cut a deal. A resigned Woodrow Wilson would have been replaced by Marshall, who would have certainly compromised. But the Woodrow Wilson trapped in the amber of Edith's protection, isolated, angry, and unheard, was incapable of saving his own creation. Edith had preserved the man, but she had killed his dream. By the spring of 1920, the charade was fraying at the edges. The press was becoming more aggressive. The Republicans were sensing blood in the water. The physical toll on Edith was immense. She had aged 10 years and 6 months, her face lined with the stress of the double burden she carried. She was the nurse to a dying man and the president of a dying administration. She had kept the door locked for half a year, but the wolves were scratching at the wood. The Senate had had enough of the rumors. They were preparing to invoke their constitutional right to inspect the executive branch. They were forming a delegation. They were coming to see the president, and this time they would not be turned away by a polite usher or a lying doctor. Edith Wilson knew the visit was inevitable. She looked at her husband, who was having a good day, meaning he could sit in a wheelchair and refrain from weeping for an hour. And she began to plan her greatest performance yet. She would not just hide the truth. She would stage a resurrection. If the Senate wanted to see the president, she would show them one, even if she had to use smoke and mirrors to do it. The petticoat government was about to face its final, most dangerous audit. By December 1919, the rumors swirling around the White House had curdled into a poisonous fog that choked the Capitol. The whisper campaign was no longer confined to the cloakrooms of the Capitol or the salons of Georgetown. It was being shouted in newsprint and debated in taverns across the nation. The American people knew something was fundamentally wrong. They felt the absence of leadership, like a phantom limb, a sensation of presence where there was only void. The president had not been seen in public for 2 months. No photographs had been released. No cabinet meetings had been chaired. The government was operating on inertia, a headless leviathan drifting through dangerous waters. And in the Senate, the patience of the Republican opposition had finally snapped. The catalyst for the final confrontation was a crisis on the Mexican border, a kidnapping of an American consul that required decisive executive action. It was the kind of foreign policy emergency that demanded a president who could read intelligence reports, convene the military brass, and issue clear orders. Instead, the response from the White House was a confused silence, followed by a series of disjointed, contradictory statements issued by the petticoat government. Senator Albert Fall, a man who combined the cunning of a desert coyote with the moral flexibility of a hired gun, saw his opening. Fall was a fierce isolationist, a bitter enemy of the League of Nations, and a man who personally loathed Woodrow Wilson. He convinced the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to appoint a special delegation to visit the White House. Their mandate was ostensibly to discuss the Mexican crisis. Their true mission, however, was far more visceral. They were a smelling committee. They were going to the executive mansion to sniff out the decay. They intended to look the president in the eye, ask him a question that wasn't scripted by his wife, and determine if he was mad, dead, or comatose. If they found proof of incapacitation, they would force the vice president to seize power before the sun set. Edith Wilson received the request for the meeting like a declaration of war. She knew exactly who Albert Fall was. She knew that he would not be satisfied with a polite refusal or a note from Dr. Grayson. If she denied him entry, Fall would go to the press and declare that the president was being held prisoner. The constitutional crisis she had spent 60 days holding back would crash down upon them instantly. She had no choice. She had to let the wolf into the sheepfold. But if she had to let him in, she would dictate the terms of the engagement. She would transform the sick room into a stage, and she would direct the performance of a lifetime. The preparations for the visit, scheduled for the afternoon of December 5th, 1919, were meticulous and chillingly theatrical. Edith and Dr. Grayson approached the problem not as medical professionals trying to comfort a patient, but as set designers preparing a haunted house. The first challenge was the lighting. The harsh winter sun streaming through the tall windows of the south facade would be unforgiving. It would reveal the grayness of Wilson's skin, the sunken hollows of his cheeks, and the terrifying vacancy that sometimes clouded his eyes. So, Edith ordered the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight. She extinguished the overhead electric chandeliers. In their place, she arranged a series of small, oil-shaded lamps. She placed the primary lamp on a table behind the headboard of the Lincoln bed. This was a master stroke of stagecraft. By backlighting the president, she threw his face into shadow. Any visitor standing at the foot of the bed would see the silhouette of Woodrow Wilson, the familiar profile of the scholar president. but would be unable to see the drool at the corner of his mouth or the lack of focus in his pupils. Next came the physical arrangement of the actor himself. Wilson was paralyzed on his left side. His left arm was a dead weight, often curling inward in a spastic contraction that was disturbing to witness. Edith propped him up against a mountain of pillows, forcing his torso into an upright posture that mimicked alertness. She took his useless left arm and tucked it underneath the blankets, pulling the sheets up high to his chest so that only his head and his right arm were visible. To the casual observer, he would look like a man resting comfortably, not a man whose body had been cleaved in half by a stroke. On the bedside table, within easy reach of his good right hand, she placed a copy of the report on the Mexican crisis. It was a prop intended to signal that he had been working, that he was engaged, that he was still the commander-in-chief. But the physical disguise was the easy part. The psychological preparation was the gamble. Wilson's mind was a landscape of fog and jagged peaks. There were hours when he was lucid, sharp, and capable of biting wit. And there were hours when he wept uncontrollably because he couldn't find a handkerchief. Edith spent the morning coaching him, rehearsing the lines, feeding him energy and resentment. She told him fall was coming to destroy him. She stoked the embers of his old hatred, hoping that anger would serve as a substitute for vitality. Dr. Grayson stood by with emergency stimulants, ready to inject the president if he began to fade. They were winding up the mainspring of a broken clock, praying it would tick for just 20 minutes. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Senator Albert Fall and Senator Gilbert Hitchcock arrived at the North Portico. Hitchcock was a Democrat, a sympathetic figure who was there mostly to ensure Fall didn't strangle the president, but Fall was the predator. As they walked through the grand foyer, the silence of the house struck them immediately. The usual bustle of messengers and aides was gone. The White House felt abandoned, a ship drifting at sea with a dead crew. They were led upstairs by a nervous usher, their footsteps echoing on the marble, up to the second-floor residential wing. The air grew heavier as they ascended, the smell of old stone and floor wax mixing with the faint, unmistakable odor of the sick room, camphor, iodine, and the stale warmth of a room that has not been aired out in weeks. They reached the door of the president's bedroom. Edith Wilson met them there. She was dressed in a dark, severe gown, standing like a sentinel. She did not smile. She ushered them in, her eyes locking onto Fall's with a look of pure, distilled loathing. The senator stepped into the gloom. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust to the darkness. The room was shadowy, the corners lost in blackness. The air was hot and still. And there, in the center of the pool of dim amber light, was the president. He was wearing a dark sweater, his white hair shocked against the pillows, his long face composed. He did not look at them immediately. He was staring straight ahead, his good eye fixed on a point in the middle distance. Senator Fall approached the bed. He was a man accustomed to the rough and tumble of frontier politics, but the atmosphere in this room unnerved him. He walked to the bedside, peering into the shadows, trying to read the president's face. He reached out and took Wilson's right hand, the good hand. He shook it perhaps a little too vigorously, testing the grip strength. "Mr. President," Fall said, his voice dripping with an exaggerated, oily solicitude that filled the quiet room. "We have all been praying for you." It was a trap, a statement designed to elicit a weak, grateful response, a confirmation of his frailty. The silence that followed stretched for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. Edith held her breath, her hand gripping the back of a chair until her knuckles turned white. Had he understood? Was he drifting? Then the corpse on the bed moved. Wilson's head snapped toward Fall. His good eye narrowed, sharpening into a point of blue steel. The old Presbyterian schoolmaster, the man who had crushed his enemies at Princeton, surged up through the layers of trauma. His voice was weak, raspy, but the diction was precise, cutting through the darkness like a razor blade. "Which way, Senator?" The retort hung in the air, brilliant and devastating. "Which way have you been praying? For my recovery or for my death?" It was a flash of the old Wilson wit, a moment of supreme intellectual dominance that totally disarmed Fall. The senator stumbled, his script shattered. He stammered something unintelligible, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. In that single, unscripted second, Wilson had won the engagement. He had proven that whatever was happening to his body, the spark of his soul, his capacity for contempt, was still intact. Edith exhaled. The gamble had paid off. But the danger wasn't over. Fall, recovering his composure, moved to the business at hand. He began to question the president about the Mexican crisis. He asked about the specific details of the consular kidnapping, about the diplomatic cables, about the proposed military response. He was probing for cognitive failure, looking for memory lapses, waiting for the president to ask Edith for the answer. Wilson did not falter. He pointed to the report on the bedside table, the prop Edith had placed there. "I have the papers here, Senator," he wheezed. "I am fully abreast yet of the situation." He spoke slowly, measuring each word to avoid slurring, but the content was coherent. When the conversation turned to a complex point of international law regarding the border, Edith stepped in smoothly. She did not answer for him. She facilitated. She handed him a piece of paper. She adjusted his pillow. She bridged the gaps in his speech with her own polished commentary, creating the illusion of a partnership rather than a regency. To Fall and Hitchcock, watching in the dim light, it appeared that the president was weak, yes, but mentally sound. They could not see the trembling of his hand under the sheet. They could not see the sweat beading on his forehead as the effort of concentration drained his battery. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. It was an eternity. By the end, Wilson was visibly graying, his head sinking lower into the pillows. Dr. Grayson, standing in the shadows like a grim reaper, signaled that the time was up. Fall and Hitchcock rose to leave. As they walked to the door, Fall turned back for one last look. The president was still watching him, his eyes burning in the gloom. The smelling committee had smelled nothing but the faint scent of medicine. They had found no drooling madman, no vegetable. They had found a wounded lion who could still bite. The senators walked out of the White House and into the waiting throng of reporters. The press demanded to know the truth. Was the president incapacitated? Was the government leaderless? Albert Fall, the man who had come to bury Caesar, found himself forced to praise him. "The president is perfectly capable of handling the situation," Fall declared to the New York Times. "His mind is clear and he is in command." It was the lie that sealed the fate of the nation. The macabre theater had been a runaway success. Edith Wilson had pulled off the greatest magic trick in political history. She had convinced the Senate that a man who could barely control his own bowels was fit to command the executive branch. The threat of the 25th Amendment, or its 1919 equivalent, vanished. The pressure to resign evaporated. The petticoat government was secure. But this victory was a Pyrrhic one, bought at a terrible price. By keeping Wilson in office, Edith ensured that the paralysis of the government would continue. The victory over Fall meant that Wilson remained the absolute authority on the Treaty of Versailles, and in his isolated, embittered state, Wilson was incapable of compromise. In the months that followed the Senate visit, the tragedy played out to its grim conclusion. The Treaty of Versailles came up for a final vote in March 1920. The mood in the Senate had shifted. There was a desperate desire to get it done, to pass the treaty with the Lodge reservations and move on. All Wilson had to do was send a signal, a nod, a wink, a single sentence saying, "Accept the reservations." If he had been healthy, if he had been engaging with his cabinet, he might have seen the necessity. But he was not healthy. He was locked in the bedroom, with only Edith and his grudges for company. When the final request for compromise arrived, Wilson, buoyed by his triumph over Fall, felt invincible in his obstinacy. He dictated a letter that was pure poison. He ordered the Democratic senators to vote against the treaty if it contained a single reservation. He demanded all or nothing. On March 19, 1920, the Senate voted. The treaty received a majority, but not the two-thirds required for ratification. It failed because loyal Democrats, following the orders of a dying man, voted against it. The United States officially rejected the League of Nations. The grand vision of a world united against war died on the floor of the Senate, killed not by the isolationists, but by the pride of its creator. The irony was suffocating. Edith Wilson had saved the president, but in doing so, she had doomed his presidency. She had kept him in the White House, but she had turned the building into a tomb for his ideals. As the news of the treaty's defeat reached the second floor, Wilson did not rage. He simply stared at the ceiling, his mind retreating further into the shadows. He had won the battle with Senator Fall, but he had lost the war for history. The macabre theater continued for another year. The government limped along, the economy cratered, violence erupted in the streets, but inside the bedroom, the play went on. Edith continued to forge signatures, screen visitors, and rule by proxy. The country was essentially on autopilot, drifting toward the roaring uncertainty of the 1920s. And what of the actors in this grotesque drama? Albert Fall would go on to become the Secretary of the Interior and land in prison for the Teapot Dome scandal, his judgment forever questioned. Dr. Grayson would carry the secrets of the sick room to his grave, burning his personal diary pages that describe the president's true condition. And Edith? She settled into her role with a terrifying comfort. She began to believe her own lie. She wasn't just the steward anymore. She was the survivor. But the most haunting image of this period remains that of Woodrow Wilson himself, a man reduced to a prop in his own life. He was a ventriloquist's dummy, animated by his wife, speaking lines he could barely understand, striking poses he couldn't hold. The macabre theater wasn't just a political deception. It was a profound violation of human dignity. It stripped a great man of the right to be weak, the right to fail, and the right to rest. It forced him to play the role of the Titan long after he had become mortal. As the election of 1920 approached, the Democrats were decimated. The American people, tired of the secrecy, the gloom, and the lack of leadership, turned en masse to Warren G. Harding and his promise of a return to normalcy. Normalcy meant a president who could walk, talk, and hold a cabinet meeting. It meant an end to the shadowy regency of the First Lady. The Wilson era was ending not with a bang, but with a long, agonizing whimper behind closed curtains. The stage lights were finally dimming, but the darkness they left behind would engulf the world for the next 2 decades. The final act of the Wilson presidency did not end with a bang, nor with a grand resignation speech, but with a slow, agonizing carriage ride into oblivion. On the morning of March 4th, 1921, the inauguration day of Warren G. Harding, the weather in Washington was crisp and bright, a stark contrast to the gloom that had shrouded the White House for 17 months. The time had come for the petticoat government to dissolve. Edith Wilson, the architect of the Great Deception, oversaw the final logistics of their departure, not as a defeated usurper, but as a triumphant guardian who had successfully run out the clock. She had accomplished her mission. Woodrow Wilson was leaving the executive mansion alive, technically, still the president, his title intact even if his legacy was in ruins. The physical spectacle of that morning was heartbreaking. For the first time in over a year, the public got a clear, unfiltered look at the man who had been governing them. What they saw was a shock. Woodrow Wilson had to be lifted into the open carriage like a fragile doll. His face was a mask of suffering, drawn and pale, the skin hanging loosely on his skull. His left arm was tucked uselessly into his coat pocket. Beside him sat Warren G. Harding, the president-elect, a man radiating health, vitality, and a cheerful mediocrity. The contrast was brutal. It was a tableau of the old world dying and the new world rushing in, the intellectual giant reduced to a cripple, replaced by a handsome backslapper who promised nothing more than a return to normalcy. The ride to the Capitol was a torture for Wilson. The carriage jolted over the cobblestones, sending waves of pain through his paralyzed body. He did not wave to the crowds. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set in a grim line, clinging to his dignity with the same ferocity with which he had clung to power. At the Capitol, he was unable to navigate the stairs. He had to be helped into a wheelchair and wheeled into the president's room to sign the final bills of his administration. It was there, surrounded by the Senate that had defeated his treaty, that the final humiliation occurred. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, his arch nemesis, the man who had destroyed the League of Nations, entered the room to inform the president that the Senate had completed its business. "Mr. President," Lodge said, his voice clipped and formal, "the Senate has no further business to transact with you." Wilson looked up from his wheelchair. His eyes, once so piercing, were now clouded with pain and hatred. "I have no further business with the Senate," he snapped. It was a lie. He had unfinished business with history, but history had already moved on. He did not stay for Harding's swearing in. He was wheeled out the back door, lifted into a private automobile, and driven away to a townhouse on S Street in northwest Washington, D.C. The curtain had fallen on the Wilson era, but the long shadow of what had happened in the White House bedroom was only just beginning to stretch across the century. The house on S Street became a living mausoleum. For the next 3 years, Woodrow Wilson lived there as a ghost in his own life. The roaring 20s exploded outside his window. Jazz, flappers, speakeasies, a culture of excess and rebellion that mocked the austere Presbyterian morality he represented. But inside the house, time stood still. Edith Wilson recreated the hermetically sealed environment of the White House sick room. She remained the gatekeeper, deciding who could see him, read to him, or speak to him. She curated his existence, shielding him from the harsh reality that the world was forgetting him. Wilson spent his days in a library filled with books he could no longer read comfortably and letters he could no longer write. He would sit by the window, watching the traffic pass on Massachusetts Avenue, a silent observer of the democracy he had once led. Occasionally, pilgrims would come to the house, loyal Democrats, idealists who still believed in the League of Nations. They would stand on the sidewalk and cheer. Wilson would hobble to the balcony, leaning heavily on a cane and wave a handkerchief. He would weep openly at these displays, his emotional control completely shattered by the stroke. It was a pathetic spectacle, the prophet of world peace, now a weeping invalid saluting a crowd that was dwindling by the month. The tragedy of these final years was not just physical, it was psychological. Wilson remained obsessed with the League of Nations. He believed with a religious fervor that the American people would eventually wake up, reject the isolationism of Harding, and embrace his vision. He drafted cryptic notes for speeches he would never give. He plotted political comebacks that were delusions of a damaged brain. And Edith fed these delusions. She told him he was right. She told him the country was turning back to him. She protected him from the truth that the League was functioning in Geneva without the United States, a toothless tiger that could bark but not bite. The end came on February 3rd, 1924. Wilson slipped into a final coma, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. As he lay dying, he uttered his last coherent sentence. I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machine is broken, I am ready. It was a rare moment of clarity, an admission that the biological reality he had fought for so long had finally won. He died quietly, with Edith holding his hand. But even in death, Edith Wilson's control was absolute. She organized the funeral not as a state occasion, but as a private, almost secretive affair. She refused to allow a lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda, denying the public a chance to say goodbye. She invited only a select few to the service at the National Cathedral. Most tellingly, she explicitly banned Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from attending. When Lodge sent a note asking to pay his respects, Edith sent back a cold refusal. The president would not want you there. She carried his grudges beyond the grave. She buried him in the crypt of the cathedral, sealing him away in stone just as she had sealed him away in the bedroom. With Wilson dead, Edith Wilson began her second act, the curator of the myth. She lived for another 37 years, surviving until 1961. She became the grande dame of the Democratic Party, a fixture at inaugurations and dinners. She wrote a memoir, My Memoir, in 1939, which became a bestseller. In it, she carefully reconstructed the narrative of the petticoat government. She denied she had ever made a political decision. She insisted she was merely a steward, a loving wife, who screened irrelevant matters to save her husband's strength. I never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs, she wrote. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not. It was a brilliant, self-serving distinction. By deciding what was important, she had decided everything. She had decided that the Treaty of Versailles was not important enough to compromise on. She had decided that the cabinet's advice was not important enough to hear. She whitewashed the history of the cover-up, painting a portrait of heroic devotion rather than constitutional subversion. And for decades, the world believed her. She was treated with reverence, the widow of S Street, the keeper of the flame. She died in 1961. Passing away just months after attending the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, spanning the era from the horse and buggy to the nuclear age. But while Edith polished the marble of Wilson's reputation, the real-world consequences of their bedroom conspiracy began to burn. The geopolitical cost of her stewardship was immediate and devastating. When Edith Wilson and her husband refused to compromise with the Senate in 1919 and 1920, they ensured that the United States would never join the League of Nations. Without American participation, the League was fatally weakened from birth. It lacked the economic and military muscle of the world's rising superpower. It became a European debating club, incapable of enforcing its resolutions. In the 1930s, as the world darkened again, the League faced its tests. Japan invaded Manchuria. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. In each case, the League protested, but without the United States, it could not act decisively. Sanctions were weak. Military intervention was non-existent. Dictators like Mussolini and Hitler watched the League's impotence and drew a simple conclusion: nobody would stop them. They were right. Had Woodrow Wilson resigned in October 1919, Vice President Thomas Marshall would have become president. Marshall was a pragmatist. He would have almost certainly compromised with Senator Lodge. The United States would have joined the League of Nations. Would a U.S.-backed league have stopped Hitler? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the absence of America created a vacuum that the dictators filled. The road to Pearl Harbor and the Holocaust was paved in part by the stubborn refusal of a paralyzed man and his protective wife to let go of power. The millions who died in World War II were the collateral damage of a constitutional crisis that was never solved. Yet, the Wilson affair left a final systemic legacy that would reshape the Constitution itself, the 25th Amendment. For decades after Wilson's death, the terrifying loophole in the Constitution remained open. What happens when a president is alive but unable to govern? The system relied on the honor of the president to resign or the courage of the vice president to step in, both of which had failed in 1919. It took another tragedy to force a change. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Congress finally woke up to the nightmare scenario. What if Kennedy had not died instantly? What if he had lingered in a coma for months, like Wilson? Who would have had the nuclear codes? Who would have dealt with the Cold War? The terrifying memory of the Wilson cover-up, combined with the nuclear stakes of the 20th century, finally spurred action. In 1967, the 25th Amendment was ratified. It established clear legal procedures for declaring a president incapacitated. It allowed the vice president and the cabinet to vote to remove a president who could not discharge his duties, even if the president or his spouse objected. It was a direct legislative response to the petticoat government. It was the system finally admitting that the health of the republic could not depend on the health of one man's arteries. The amendment was a posthumous rebuke to Edith Wilson. It was the Constitution saying never again. History has struggled to categorize Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. To label her a villain ignores her motivation. To call her a heroine ignores the wreckage she left behind. She was not motivated by malice, but by a fierce Victorian sense of duty that placed her husband above the Constitution. By placing her husband above the Constitution, she betrayed the very democracy he claimed to champion. She disenfranchised the American voter. She decapitated the executive branch during a global crisis. She allowed personal grievances to dictate national policy. And in her refusal to let go, she inadvertently sabotaged the only thing that might have prevented the next World War. The story of the first female president remains less a feminist triumph than a cautionary tale regarding the grotesque fragility of power. It reveals the grotesque fragility of power. We like to believe that history is shaped by great forces, economics, ideology, geography, but the story of 1919 teaches us that history is also shaped by the biological accidents of the human body. A blood clot the size of a marble in the brain of one man and the fierce determination of one woman to hide it shifted the trajectory of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson wanted to make the world safe for democracy. In the end, his wife made the White House safe for him, but unsafe for the world. The secrets of that darkened bedroom have long since been exposed to the light, but the lesson remains. When power is personalized, when it is hidden behind closed doors and shielded from accountability, it rots. And the stench of that rot can linger for generations. The Wilson presidency ended in a twilight of silence, but its echoes are still heard every time a leader falters, every time a health record is hidden, and every time the fate of the many rests in the trembling hands of the few. The shadow president may be gone, but the shadow itself never truly disappears.